Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorrow I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, and just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that passing there, had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Good evening, listeners. This is Professor Jonas Armitage, and you're listening to Stories from Dark Places. Tonight's poem is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, a personal favorite. The story continues to be The King in Yellow by Robert Chambers. I hope you're enjoying the story. It's been an interesting read for me. I look forward to seeing how this all entwines with the subject of the book, as eponymous as the story's title itself. We shall get on to tonight's story in just a moment. But first, a message from our sponsors. Hello, listeners. Looking for more tales to entertain with esoteric delight and supernatural suspense? I would encourage you to check out Peculiar Stories. Join Indiana Beckett as she takes you on a walk around her particular side of the neighborhood in all things strange and unusual. You may find her on Anchor Podcasts or anywhere that your podcast can be found. There are so many things which are impossible to explain. Why should certain chords in music make me think of the brown and golden tints of autumn foliage? Why should the Mass of St. Cecile bend my thoughts wandering among caverns whose walls blaze with ragged masses of virgin silver? What was it in the roar and turmoil of Broadway at 6 o'clock that flashed before my eyes the picture of a still Breton forest where sunlight filtered through spring foliage, and Sylvia bent, half curiously, half tenderly, over a small green lizard, murmuring to think that this also is a little ward of God? When I first saw the watchman, his back was toward me. I looked at him indifferently until he went into the church. I paid no more attention to him than I had any other man who lounged through Washington Square that morning. And when I shut my window and turned back into my studio, I had forgotten him. Later in the afternoon, the day being warm, I raised the window again and leaned out to get a sniff of air. A man was standing in the courtyard of the church, and I noticed him again with as little interest as I had the morning. I looked across the square to where the fountain was playing, and then, with my mind filled with vague impressions of trees, asphalt drives, and the moving groups of nursemaids and holidaymakers, I started to walk back to my easel. As I turned, my listless gaze included the man below in the churchyard. His face was toward me now, and with a perfectly involuntary movement I bent to see it. At the same moment he raised his head and looked at me. Instantly, I thought of a coffin worm. Whatever it was about the man that repelled me, I did not know, but the impression of a plump, white grave worm was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it in my expression, for he turned his puffy face away with a movement which made me think of a disturbed grub in a chestnut. I went back to my easel and mentioned the model to resume her pose. After working a while, I was satisfied that I was spoiling what I had done as rapidly as possible, and took up a palette knife and scraped the color out again. The flesh tones were sallow and unhealthy, and I did not understand how I could have painted such sickly color in a study which before that had glowed with healthy tones. I looked at Tessie. She had not changed, and the clear flush of health dyed her neck and cheeks as I frowned. "Is it something I've done?" she said. "No, I've made a mess of this arm, and for the life of me I can't see how I came to paint such mud as this onto the canvas," I replied. Well, don't I pose well? She insisted. Of course, perfectly. Then it's not my fault? No, it's my own. I'm very sorry, she said. I told her she could rest while I applied rag and turpentine to the plague spot on my canvas, and she went off to smoke a cigarette and look over the illustrations in the Courrier Français. I did not know whether it was something in the turpentine or a defect in the canvas, but the more I scrubbed, the more that gangrene seemed to spread. I worked like a beaver to get it out, and yet the disease appeared to creep from limb to limb of the study before me. Alarmed, I strove to arrest it, but now the color of the breast changed, and the whole figure seemed to absorb the infection as a sponge soaks up water. Vigorously, I plied palette knife, turpentine, and scraper, thinking all the time what a séance I should hold with Duval, who had sold me the canvas. But soon I noticed that it was not the canvas which was defective, nor yet the colors of Edward. It must be the turpentine, I thought angrily, or else my eyes have become so blurred and confused by the afternoon light I can't see straight. I called Tessie, the model. She came and leaned over my chair, blowing rings of smoke into the air. What have you been doing to it? She exclaimed. Nothing, I growled. It must be the turpentine. What a horrible color it is now, she continued. Do you think my flesh resembles green cheese? No, I don't, I said angrily. Did you ever know me to paint like that before? No, indeed. Well, then. It must be the turpentine or something, she admitted. She slipped on a Japanese robe and walked to the window. I scraped and rubbed until I was tired, and finally picked up my brushes and hurled them through the canvas with a forcible expression, the tone alone of which reached Tessie's ears. Nevertheless, she promptly began, That's it. I swear it acts silly and ruin your brushes. You've been 3 weeks on that study, and now look. What's the good of ripping the canvas? What creatures artists are. I felt about as much ashamed as I usually did after such an outbreak, and I turned the ruined canvas to the wall. Tessie helped me clean my brushes, and then danced away to dress. From the screen, she regaled me with bits of advice concerning whole or partial loss of temper, until, thinking perhaps I had been tormented sufficiently, she came out to implore me to button her waist where she could not reach it on the shoulder. Everything went wrong from the time you came back from the window and talked about that horrid-looking man you saw in the churchyard, she announced. He probably bewitched the picture, I said, yawning. I looked at my watch. It's after 6, I know, said Tessie, adjusting her hat before the mirror. Yes, I replied, and I didn't mean to keep you so long. I leaned out of the window, but recoiled with disgust, for the young man with the pasty face stood below in the churchyard. Tessie saw my gesture of disapproval and leaned from the window. Is that the man you don't like? She whispered. I nodded. Well, I can't see his face, but he does look fat and soft, some way or other. She continued, turning to look at me. He reminds me of a dream. An awful dream I once had. Or, she mused, looking down at her shapely shoes, was it a dream after all? How should I know? I smiled. Tessie smiled in reply. Well, you were in it, she said, so perhaps you might know something about it. Tessie, I protested, don't you dare flatter by saying that you dream about me. Oh, but I did, she insisted. Shall I tell you about it? Go ahead, I replied, lighting a cigarette. Tessie leaned back on the open windowsill and began, very seriously. One night last winter I was lying in bed, thinking about nothing at all in particular. I had been posing for you and was tired out, yet it seemed impossible for me to sleep. I heard the bells in the city ring 10, 11, and midnight, and I must have fallen asleep about midnight because I don't remember hearing the bells after that. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I dreamed that something impelled me to go to the window. I rose, and, raising the sash, leaned out. 25th Street was deserted as far as I could see. I began to be afraid. Everything outside seemed so black and uncomfortable. And then the sound of wheels in the distance came to my ears, and it seemed to me as though that was what I must wait for. Very slowly the wheels approached, and finally I could make out a vehicle moving along the street. It came nearer and nearer, and when it passed beneath the window I saw it was a hearse. And then, as I trembled with fear, the driver turned and looked straight at me. When I awoke I was standing by the open window, shivering with cold. but the black-plumed hearse and the driver were gone. I dreamed this dream again in March last, and again awoke beside the open window. Last night the dream came again. You remember how it was raining? When I awoke, standing at the open window, my nightdress was soaked. But where did I come into the dream? I asked. You were in the coffin, but you weren't dead. In the coffin? Yes. How did you know? Could you see me? No, I only knew you were there. Had you been eating Welsh rarebits or lobster salad? I began, laughing, but the girl interrupted me with a frightened cry. Hello, what's up? I said as she shrank into the embrasure by the window. The man below in the churchyard. He drove the hearse. Nonsense, I said, but Tessie's eyes were wide with terror. I went to the window and looked out. The man was gone. Oh, come, Tessie, I urged. Don't be foolish. You've posed too long. You're nervous. Do you think I could forget that face? She murmured. 3 times I saw the hearse pass below my window, and every time the driver turned and looked up at me. Oh, his face was so white and soft. It looked dead. It looked as if it had been dead a long time. I induced the girl to sit and swallow a glass of marsala. Then I sat down beside her and tried to give her some advice. Look here, Tessie, I said. You go to the country for a week or 2, and you'll have no more dreams about hearses. You pose all day, and when night comes, your nerves are upset. You can't keep this up. And then again, instead of going to bed when your day's work is done, you run off to picnics at Sulzer Park, or go to the El Dorado or Coney Island. And when you come down here next morning, you're fagged out. There was no real hearse. It was a soft-shell crab dream. She smiled faintly. What about the man in the churchyard? Oh, he's only an ordinary, unhealthy, everyday creature. As true as my name is Tessie Reardon, I swear to you, Mr. Scott, that the face of the man below in the churchyard is the face of the man who drove the hearse. What of it? I said. It's an honest trade. Then you think I did see a hearse? Oh, I said diplomatically, if you really did, it might not be unlikely that the man below drove it. There's nothing in that. Tessie rose, unrolled her scented handkerchief, and taking a bit of gum from a knot in the hem, placed it in her mouth. Then, drawing on her gloves, she offered me her hand with a frank "Good night, Mr. Scott," and walked out. You know, the more you look into Robert W. Chambers, the more you find a man of curious mentality. During a period of civil unrest, when there was a war for the world on the horizon, he still found time to write books, deep spanning collections of stories, and was heavily criticized because people didn't understand or appreciate the abstract concepts he introduced. For example, he wrote a book called The Man They Hanged about Captain Kidd and argued on the behalf of the pirates, saying that he was merely a victim of the British government, a scapegoat to misdirect from others. It's an interesting consideration and makes you wonder what sort of transitions happen across a generation that lead people's opinions to be so deeply skewed. Anyway, that's all the time we have for now. Join us next week for the next part of our story, and please have a safe and wonderful holiday tomorrow. Good night, listeners. Remember, in the deepest, darkest parts of the night, when you are uncertain as to whether or not you are alone, remember this: there is nothing to be afraid of. After all, some of the best things only happen in the dark.
Stories from Dark Places was recorded before an imaginary studio audience. All stories performed on this podcast have express written consent from the original owner. Jonas Armitage, his studio manager, and the entire staff of WZHP Radio Innsmouth are fictitious characters, and it's probably for the best that you continue to believe that.